On the day I was born, Albert Hofmann was at home, recovering from a brief brush of LSD. A couple of days later, he went back to the lab to try and figure out what had happened, and then he had his major discovery. That discovery was, I think, pivotal culturally, because up until the point that he discovered the psychotropic effects of LSD, the only substances that were capable of producing similar effects were things derived from plants and animals. And they were usually accompanied by cultural stuff, indigenous cultural things, and they were not easy to produce. I won't go into the details of that. They're all been written about numerous times. But the significance of Hofmann's discovery was, for the first time in the history of the world, an easily reproducible, an easily manufactured substance. It was also cheap and didn't require a whole lot of biochemical knowledge. This is the first time something like that had happened. Hofmann's discovery occurred in the middle of the Second World War, so it didn't get broadcast widely, didn't get published, and it got on a very slow trajectory. It became, into the 50s, mainly something of interest to a small group of scientists, intellectuals, artists, and it remained pretty much below the radar. Into the 50s, it grew a little, awareness of it grew a little bit, and a guy named Tim Leary got a hold of an analog of it, psilocybin. But even then, there was not a whole lot of awareness early on. But it's important to note that the kind of experience that was produced by things like LSD and psilocybin had also been, all through the course of human history, had been facilitated by shamanic techniques, chanting, dancing, singing, drumming. So the kind of experience that LSD produced was not unusual in human history. The effect of Hofmann's discovery was just that it was the first time in history that you had an industrial substance, an industrially manufacturable substance made available. And as I said, it took a little while for the trajectory of awareness to develop. And it wasn't until the 1960s that the awareness became widespread. The 1960s is famous for the appearance of what was called the counterculture. Before that, there were a few people that were, there was a fellow named Ken Ken Kesey, who published a novel called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest that became widely known. It's still being produced in films and theater today. But it wasn't about LSD, what happened, but Kesey's experience with LSD had alerted him to, it gave him a different perspective. He was working in a locked ward at a mental hospital in California. And his enhanced awareness and the fact that he was a good writer gave him to produce a pretty amazing book. But again, we're still pretty much under the radar. Another guy, Stuart Brand, had come into the beginnings of the counterculture in terms of thinking about communal situations. He'd come out of the army. He was actually working in the Pentagon at one point. He became a photographer in the army. He decided he didn't want to go to Ranger School and became a photographer instead. And while he was still in the army at Fort Dix, he became familiar with the beat bohemian scene in Lower Manhattan. Eventually, he went on to produce the Whole Earth Catalog, which became the Bible of the counterculture, so to speak. And he put on it a picture of the Earth from space, the first picture, called it the Whole Earth Catalog. And it was the beginning of a phenomenon of networking that led to the development of the personal computer. And so we can think of the trajectory from counterculture to cyberculture as one of the themes related to the appearance of LSD. When the counterculture, the hippies, became noticed by the media, the phenomenon was magnified greatly. And even though the so-called hippies were a very small group in the population, they were exciting to the media. And it was blown, the awareness of them was blown all out of proportion by the media. That publicity, however, became a cause that could be picked up by people like a man named Ainsley, who had originally been in charge of the Office of Prohibition, alcohol prohibition. And when prohibition was, when the amendment that had declared prohibition was eliminated, Ainsley was left with just the office without much to do. He was a clever fellow and came up with a campaign against marijuana, which was heavily informed by racism. He touted marijuana as a tool of Negroes and jazz musicians designed to seduce white women. And he pulled it off. managed to get marijuana not prohibited, but heavily taxed, and then the state prohibitions came in. He leveraged that ultimately into the war on drugs. And there's the fellow that was the chairman of the committee that was developing legislation concerning the war on drugs, a senator named Rybakov, has acknowledged that if you want reform, publicity is the key. He had the publicity, and LSD was criminalized. The effect of the criminalization was to bring a halt to all the research, almost all the research that was going on. And LSD was classed in the same class as heroin. So it became a major target for federal police, state police, people who were interested in suppressing an undesirable element. LSD being cheap and easy to manufacture, there was one other fellow I'll mention specifically, a guy named Augustus Owsley Stanley, high school dropout, had little knowledge of chemistry, started making LSD in his bathroom. He was raided, but the cops were looking for methamphetamine. He had a good lawyer. The lawyer got the charge dismissed because there was no methamphetamine. The cops had seized his equipment. They were forced to give it back. Owsley moved from LA to locations that couldn't be easily found. And he produced LSD in a huge quantity that became sort of the gold standard of the counterculture. Besides Ainsley's campaign, racist-based campaign, the counterculture had gotten heavily involved with the anti-war movement. The draft for young men was a bit like the pandemic we're experiencing today, a threat that hung over their head. This gave added impulse to the prohibition, criminalization of psychedelics. And sort of inadvertently, perhaps because Hofmann worked for a drug company, a pharmaceutical company, LSD had gotten labeled as a drug. Its proper label is probably more as a sacrament. A sacrament on the level of tobacco as it was perceived, as it was used by indigenous tribes, or wine as it was used in the Greek mysteries, Dionysian mysteries, as it became a sacrament in the Roman Church. But because it was labeled a drug, That brought it into the political scene. A capable fellow named Rick Doblin, who had connected up with a psychiatrist, psychologist named Stanislav Grof, connected with him because Grof had been one of the early LSD researchers and probably has been the most important researcher. Grof ended up, after a series of good fortune incidents, ended up at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. He had done some amazing work with terminal cancer patients out of Johns Hopkins and the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. But when the research funds dried up, he fortunately found an appointment as scholar in residence at Esalen. Esalen was the crossroads of the counterculture, and the various influences he found there helped him develop a method, a technique, which is reflective of the long history of shamanism. A simple technique, which, though not as sure as a chemical or a psychedelic substance, leads many people to the same kind of experience. So beside the influences at Esalen and the influence of a man named Wilhelm Reich were pivotal for Stan, who had started out intending to become a cartoonist in Czechoslovakia, found a contraband book of Freud's interpretation of dreams, and switched to medical school to become a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst. His story is readily available. This fellow, Rick Doblin, had had some very powerful experiences at LSD. The connection with Stan Grof further inspired him, and he went to school. He went to graduate school to get a degree in public health, developed facility with bureaucracy and legal and regulatory matters, and developed an organization which is called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS for short, that has raised millions of dollars and actually took advantage of the designation of LSD as a drug, LSD and other psychedelics as drugs, to a bureaucracy. And his organization is now in the final stages, the last, the stage phase 3 clinical trial, and in which MDMA, another psychedelic, has been demonstrated to be a very effective means of treating post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is the mental condition du jour for some time now. And while Rick has used has co-opted the designation of a psychedelic, in this case MDMA, while he's co-opted that and turned it to advantage using the drug characterization of it. His long-term goal is well beyond that. As he says in his latest annual report, the annual report for 2020, we believe that the potential Food and Drug Administration approval of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, will be followed by regulatory approvals around the world. This will be followed by the establishment of thousands of psychedelic clinics with therapists cross-trained to provide therapy assisted by MDMA and other psychedelics. Eventually, in a post-prohibition world, there could be a licensed regulatory system for adults to legally access psychedelics, to take on their own, without supervision by therapists. So while he's playing the psychiatry game, his ultimate aim is just the plain removal of prohibition and returning to humanity its birthright, which was largely suppressed by which was first suppressed by the church in the Middle Ages, who didn't like people having direct experience of the divine, but preferred the intermediacy of a priest. Another interesting angle that's being pursued is via the First Amendment in the US. The United States is unique in that, unique from Europe, in that we have never had religious wars. And many of the people that came to this country were in fact fleeing oppression by the state churches in Europe. There's never been a state church in the United States. And what's more, the founders of the country were so concerned to keep state religion at bay that the First Amendment to the Constitution specifically restricts the ability of the government to make laws regarding religion. That amendment has been used in two cases. One, the Native American Church is allowed to use peyote as a sacrament. Peyote, which contains the substance mescaline. And then two churches, Santo Daime and União de Vegetal, now have the protection they need to use ayahuasca, which is in which the active substance is DMT, but there's another substance in there, harmine, which keeps DMT from being metabolized. We're getting into the weeds a little bit. So if the prohibition, and surely MAPS activity is going to result in the end of it in the next few years, and the religious, the lawsuits that are in process for establishing the right to use psychedelics as a religious right. A whole new phase, I think, will be opened up. And we'll be able to investigate psychedelics and the kind of experience that they can facilitate in a way that's never been possible before in history, because mystical experience, I prefer the term exceptional experience, mystical experience has always been relatively rare and basically difficult to achieve, often coming at random. I mean, shamanic functions, the Greek mysteries were ways of facilitating that kind of experience, but it doesn't work for everybody. Psychedelics are probably on a par with the telescope and the microscope in terms of their capacity to facilitate the exploration of human experience. I don't say human consciousness because I think consciousness is not the crux, but experiences, and that is interestingly, has an interesting cosmological, a new paradigm for exploration. I mean, our mainline science works now, particularly in terms of the Cartesian-Newtonian paradigm, the materialist perspective, that the fundamental things of the universe are little chunks of matter, atoms, molecules, subatomic particles, and so on and so on. Strings, you name it. Whitehead proposes a new paradigm, organic paradigm, in which the fundamental elements of the universe, are experiences. Experiences are much more accessible than atoms and molecules. Everybody has experience. And Whitehead, part of the impetus for Whitehead's paradigm is the work of William James, who said our experience grows by drops and buds, and who talked about consciousness as a function, not as a stuff or an entity like it's conceived in the Newtonian Cartesian paradigm. And Whitehead's idea leads to a characterization of the self as a series of experiences rather than a container into which things are put, into which things come and out of which things go. That container theory traces back through the, after Descartes, it comes up through the British empiricists, etc. So psychedelics give us a chance to explore experience in its deepest manifestations, because one of the best ways to describe psychedelics is, and I borrow this from Stanislav Grof, as amplifiers of one's psychic mental experience. Whitehead's idea is not that all experience is contained in the brain, but that every moments of experience happen, become, and perish. And a takeaway from that is that the past is real. It's not just something that you remember in your brain, but it's a reality. This leads to a whole new way of looking at catharsis. Things like the idea of past lives. In Whitehead's perspective, you can actually begin to think about, at least in some felt way, accessing the entire past of the universe. That is a way too big topic for us to deal with at this point in the time we have remaining. But it promises a huge new era of of intellectual and philosophical investigation. An investigation of things like time, the whole idea of mental illness, the whole phenomenon of perception. It's long been part of philosophy's concern. But I'll finish up by reading a little bit here. In this investigation of psychedelic philosophy, we are choosing to consider psychedelics in a broad perspective, rather than the confines of the psychiatric guild, the mechanisms of neurophysiology, or the bureaucratic instructions of modern politics. Psychiatry has not freed itself from the myth of mental illness. Neurophysiology does not see beyond the brain, and bureaucracy does not escape the whims of politics. The aim of seriously pursued psychedelic experience is the discovery of the springs of well-being for people and for the human community. The future lies not in regulation, but in education. The only role of regulation is to ensure the purity of substances, as for alcohol and tobacco, for instance, and to prevent callous or ignorant harm to the community. Psychedelic substances are as surely sacraments as tobacco for the Native Americans or wine for the Christian communion. Some of the great uses of psychedelics are scientific and metaphysical research, encouragement to community after the manner of sacred groups and tribal shamanism, promotion of attitude change and creativity necessary to address the planetary ecological crisis. The foundation required to support these uses is education to their right use, education to our duty of responsibility for the human future, and the sacred understanding of personal relationship to the world.